Not welcome here anymore, Dad. Karen's made that very clear, and honestly, so have I. That was my son, my only son, standing in the doorway of the guest room I'd been living in for 14 months, arms crossed, not even looking me in the eye. His wife was somewhere down the hall. I could hear the television. Some home renovation show, the kind where everything gets fixed in 42 minutes. I sat on the edge of the bed and didn't say a word. That's the thing people don't understand about a moment like that. You don't cry. You don't argue. You go very, very still. The way you do when something shifts inside you that you know will never shift back. Let me back up. My name is Charles Beaumont. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years working as a structural engineer for a firm in Columbus, Ohio. I watched buildings go up. I watched bridges get built. I understood load bearing. I understood how much weight a structure could hold before it started to crack. I should have applied that to my family. My wife, Elaine. And I know I said I'd call people by their relationships, but Elaine deserves her name. She deserves her name. She deserves every good thing. Elaine passed away 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 6 weeks from diagnosis to gone. We had 38 years together, and then we had 6 weeks of hospitals and hand-holding and her telling me not to make a fuss, which was so completely her that even thinking about it now makes me smile through the ache. After she passed, I stayed in our house in Columbus for about a year and a half. It was a 4-bedroom colonial we'd bought in 1991 for $187,000 and paid off in full by 2009. The neighborhood had changed a lot over the decades, in good ways mostly, and when I finally had an appraisal done, I nearly fell out of my chair. The house was worth $680,000. I wasn't planning to sell. That house was 30 years of our life, but the stairs were getting harder, the yard felt like a punishment, and I was eating cereal for dinner 3 nights a week because cooking for one felt pointless. My doctor told me I needed to reduce stress. My neighbor told me I needed a hobby. My son called and said he and his wife had been talking and they'd love for me to come live with them. My son's name is Brett. He's 41. He works in logistics management, whatever that means exactly. Something with supply chains, lots of spreadsheets, conference calls at 7 a.m. He lives in a suburb of Cincinnati in a 4-bedroom house with his wife Karen and their 2 kids, Lily and Jace. Lily is 10. Jace is 7. I love those kids, like breathing. The arrangement seems straightforward. I would sell the house in Columbus, move into their guest room while I figured out my next steps, and contribute to household expenses in the meantime. Brett mentioned $2,000 a month would help with the mortgage. I said I'd do $2,500. I meant it as generosity. I understand now that it was interpreted as an opening bid. I moved in on a Tuesday in March 2 years ago. Karen had set up the guest room nicely. New bedding, a small desk, a lamp I recognized from a catalog. She gave me a tour of the kitchen like I was a hotel guest checking in. Where the coffee was, what shelf in the fridge was mine, which bathroom to use. She was pleasant, efficient. I told myself that was just her personality. The first few months were fine. I took the grandkids to school twice a week so Brett and Karen could both be out of the house by 7:30. I helped Lily with her reading homework. Jason and I built a birdhouse in the garage over 3 weekends in May, a proper one with a slanted roof and a little perch, and he talked about it for a month afterward. I cooked dinner on Thursdays. I kept my space tidy. I paid my $2,500 like clockwork on the first of every month, plus I covered groceries most weeks, which nobody counted but probably should have. I thought it was working. What I didn't see, what I couldn't see from inside it, was that Karen had a particular way of managing things. People, situations, conversations. She was the kind of person who never raised her voice, never said anything outright cruel, but slowly, steadily rearranged the furniture of a situation until you were standing somewhere you hadn't intended to be. It started small. Comments about my schedule. Was I planning to be home for dinner because she liked to plan ahead? Questions about the garage. I'd left some of my woodworking tools in there. Was I going to be using those regularly? Mentions of the grandkids' routine, how important consistency was for children, how hard it was when there was a lot of extra movement in the house. I started tiptoeing, literally and otherwise. Then in October, about 7 months in, Brett mentioned, casually over the kitchen table on a Sunday morning, that they were thinking about refinancing the mortgage. Rates were shifting. It was a good time. They'd been talking to a financial advisor. He paused and said they'd actually looked at their whole financial picture, and they were curious, just out of curiosity, what my situation looked like, whether I had much saved up. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. Not suspicion, not yet. More like the faint feeling you get when the barometric pressure drops before a storm. Something in the air changes before you understand why. I told him I was comfortable. I had savings, I had my retirement accounts, I had Elaine's life insurance payout. I told him I wasn't going to be a burden to anyone. He said of course not, of course. He wasn't implying anything. Karen refilled her coffee and didn't look up. 2 weeks later, he asked more directly. He said they were looking at an addition on the house, a proper in-law suite, something more permanent, more comfortable for me. It would cost around $180,000. He wondered if I'd be interested in contributing, given that it would essentially be my space. I said I'd think about it. I did think about it. I thought about it for 2 weeks, and I also thought about the fact that I had not been asked if I wanted a permanent suite. I'd been told one was being planned and then asked to fund it. I thought about the shift in how Karen spoke to me. Less like a guest now, more like a complication. I thought about how Brett had stopped asking how I was and started asking how long I planned to stay. Not rudely, just practically. The way you check the expiration date on something. I declined edition. I said I wasn't sure I wanted something that permanent, that I was still figuring out my longer-term plan. Brett nodded. Karen smiled, the smile she made when she was filing something away for later. After that, the temperature in the house dropped. It was nothing I could point to. My coffee shelf in the refrigerator got slightly smaller. The garage became off-limits on weekends. Brett was using it for something. I was never quite sure what. Karen started making comments about noise, about my TV volume, about the fact that I apparently made too much coffee in the mornings and the smell bothered her. I started spending more time in my room. I told myself I was being sensitive. I told myself this was just what it was like to live in someone else's space. I was the guest. I was the extra. In January, so about 11 months in, my son sat me down and told me they needed to reassess the arrangement. Karen wasn't comfortable. He said it 3 times in that conversation. Karen wasn't comfortable. He never said what, specifically, she wasn't comfortable with. Just that she wasn't, and he had to respect that. I asked him what he was suggesting. He looked at the wall behind me and said maybe I should start looking for something more independent. A senior living community, or a condo. Something more suited to my situation. My situation. I said nothing. I nodded. I went to bed that night and stared at the ceiling and thought about 38 years with Elaine and how she would have handled this, and the answer was that she would have handled it very differently because she never would have let it get this far. She had a way of seeing people clearly that I'd always relied on and never developed myself. I started looking at condos in the area. I found a nice 1-2 bedrooms, first floor, a little community pool about 8 miles away. I was ready to make an offer. And then my son appeared in the doorway of my room on a Thursday night and said what he said. "You're not welcome here anymore, Dad." Karen's made that very clear, and honestly, so have I. I looked at my son. I looked at the lines around his eyes, the way he was holding his jaw, the careful blankness of his expression. All the things Karen had coached out of him over 12 years of marriage. And I thought, he's not cruel. He's just weak. And somehow that was worse. I said, "I'll be gone by the weekend." He looked relieved. That was the thing that settled it for me, the relief on his face. I drove to the condo on Friday morning and made an offer in cash. Full asking price, $310,000, close in 21 days. The realtor looked at me like I'd done something remarkable. I hadn't. I just stopped hesitating. I was out of Brett's house by Saturday afternoon. 2 trips with my car, 1 with a rented van. I left the guest room the way I found it, made the bed, wiped down the surfaces, took my birdhouse materials from the garage. Karen came out while I was loading the van. She stood on the porch with her arms folded and watched. She did not offer to help. She did not say anything. I nodded at her from the driveway, and she went inside. Brett helped carry 2 boxes. He said, "Let me know if you need anything," in the voice of someone who very much hopes not to be taken up on that. The moment I pulled out of their driveway and onto the street, I rolled down the window. It was a cold March day, gray sky, that particular Ohio, Indiana area cold that gets in through your collar no matter what you're wearing. And I genuinely felt, like something enormous had been set down. I stopped at a diner on the way to the new place, had eggs and toast and coffee at the counter. Talked to the woman on the stool next to me. She was a retired school librarian named Peggy, who was passing through on her way to visit her sister. We talked for 40 minutes. I paid for her coffee. It was the best conversation I'd had in 14 months. When I got to the condo, I sat in an empty living room with nothing but a folding chair I'd remembered to bring, and I made some calls. First call was to my financial advisor, a woman named Sandra. No, wait, I said I wouldn't use names from the file. My financial advisor. I told her what had happened and what I needed to do. She'd been managing my accounts for 9 years and knew my situation well. We talked for an hour. Here's what I had. The $680,000 from the house sale, minus closing costs and the condo purchase, left me with roughly $318,000 liquid. Add to that $490,000 in IRAs and a 401k, plus Elaine's life insurance, $105,000, which I had never touched, plus my Social Security, which I delayed taking until 66 to maximize the benefit, was coming in at $2,890 a month. My pension from the engineering firm, 31 years, defined benefit plan, old school, paid $3,400 a month. Total net worth, conservatively calculated, just over $1.1 million. Brett didn't know the exact number, but Karen had done the math on what she could estimate. The house, the pension, the fact that I'd paid cash for the condo, and she had pushed her husband to push me out the door before I settled somewhere too permanently or started giving money to people other than them. That's the thing about people who see others as resources. They think everyone else is doing the same thing. Second call I made was to an estate attorney. A good one. I asked my financial advisor for a referral, and she gave me a name immediately. Said she was the best in the area. I made an appointment for the following week. The third call I made was to Lily and Jace's school. I'd been on the pickup list. I asked to be removed. That one was hard. That one I had to sit with for a while after. Over the next 3 weeks, I bought furniture. Not all at once. I've never liked an empty house, but I also don't like making decisions fast. I found a leather armchair at an estate sale that looked like it was built in 1978 and would last another 50 years. I got a kitchen table that seats 4 because I intended to have people over again. I found a local woodworking club that met Tuesday evenings at a community center about 2 miles away. 8 people, mostly retired, including a retired machinist named Herb who became my first real friend in Cincinnati proper. He'd grown up in Kentucky, had hands like a structural map of everything he'd ever built, and he didn't ask me a single personal question for 3 weeks, which I found deeply refreshing. I also got a dog, a 6-year-old beagle from the county shelter named, well, the shelter called him Biscuit, which I thought was a fine enough name and kept. He had one slightly crooked ear and a philosophical attitude toward most things in life, and he immediately took up residence on the leather armchair and has shown no intention of leaving. It was during my 3rd week in the condo that Brett called. Not to check in, not to ask how I was settling. He called because the automated payment I'd had set up, the $2,500 a month, had, obviously, not come through on the 1st of the month. He asked if I'd forgotten. I told him I hadn't forgotten. There was a long pause. He said he and Karen were counting on that they'd factored it into the mortgage payment. I said that sounded like a planning problem on their end, not mine. He got quiet in a way that meant he was standing somewhere Karen could hear him. He said he was sure we could work something out. I said there was nothing to work out. I said I was no longer a guest in their home, so I was no longer contributing to their household expenses. I said I wished him well. He called again 4 days later. This time the tone was different, less management, more something real. He said things were tighter than he'd let on, that Karen had been pushing to upsize the house, that they'd stretched on their current mortgage, that his company had done a round of restructuring in February, and his position was technically safe, but his bonus was gone. He said they'd been relying on my contributions more than he'd been willing to admit. I said, Brett, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. He said, okay. I said, was this Karen's idea, asking me to move in, all of it? The pause was long enough to be its own answer. Then he said, she thought it made sense, given your situation. My situation. There it was again. I said, I see. And then I said, I'm going to tell you some things and I'd like you to just listen. I told him that over the 14 months I lived with them, I had paid $35,000 in monthly contributions. I'd covered approximately $14,000 in groceries. I had paid for 2 home repairs, the water heater, and a section of fence that needed replacing, totaling $6,800. I had driven his children to school and activities, conservatively, 80 to 90 times. I had been informed I was not welcome and asked to leave, and I had done so without making it difficult for anyone. I told him I had met with an estate attorney 3 weeks prior. I had a new will. Everything was in a trust. Not for him, not for Karen, for Lily and Jace, structured so that they could access it at 25 for education, at 30 for a home purchase, and fully at 35. The trust had an independent trustee. It could not be redirected. It could not be borrowed against. It could not be accessed by their parents under any circumstances. I told him I had also set up a 529 for each of them, fully funded. Willie's college was covered. Jace's college was covered. Whatever happened between me and Brett, those kids were not going to be collateral damage. He was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, Dad, I'm sorry. I said, I know you are. He said, I let it get out of hand. I didn't. She kept saying you had so much, that you didn't need it, that we were the ones actually working and raising kids, and I said, Brett, stop. Not harshly, just firmly, the way you stop a structure from going further in the wrong direction. I don't need an explanation. I need you to understand that I love you. I love those kids. And what happened in that house was not something I deserved. You know that, even if you don't want to say it out loud. He didn't say anything for a moment, and then quietly he said, I know. I told him I wasn't going to help with the mortgage. I told him if they needed to downsize, that was a decision they'd have to make. I told him I was not a financial solution to a problem I didn't create. But I also told him that if he wanted to bring the kids over one Saturday, I had a birdhouse project I'd been meaning to start. That Jace would probably like it. That Lily was old enough to try the fret saw if she was careful. He said he'd think about it. That was 4 months ago. Brett called 3 weeks later and asked about the Saturday. He brought the kids without Karen. We spent 4 hours in my garage. I'd set up a proper little workshop by then. Herb had helped me build a workbench, and Jace nearly levitated with excitement over the compound miter saw. Lily, who I'd always thought of as the quieter one, turned out to have a precise, patient hand with the detail work. She asked me questions the whole afternoon. Not kid questions. Real ones. What kind of wood holds stain best? Whether you can fix a crooked cut or have to start over. How long it takes to get good at something. I told her longer than you wanted to, and that's what makes it worth it. They've come over 4 more times since then. Brett comes in, has coffee, talks to me like a person again. Karen hasn't come. That's her choice, and I've made my peace with it. My son is in there somewhere under all that accommodation he's built up over 12 years. I'm patient. I have time. Biscuit is on the armchair right now, watching me with one eyebrow raised, thoroughly suspicious of the laptop. The Tuesday Woodworking Club is tomorrow night. Herb has a project he wants help designing. Something involving a corner joint he can't quite figure out. My pension came in on the 1st, same as it always does. My coffee is exactly as strong as I like it. Last week, Lily texted me, her first time texting me directly, from her own phone, which apparently she just got, and the message said, Grandpa, when can we come back? I want to try the fret saw. I wrote back, anytime you want, sweetheart. The garage is always open. I don't need much. I never did. But I spent 14 months making myself smaller to fit inside someone else's calculation of what I was worth, and I am done with that. My house is quiet and it is mine. I know what's in the coffee shelf in the refrigerator because I put it there. The dog takes the best chair and I let him because I can. The windows face east and in the morning the light comes in at an angle Elaine would have loved. And I sit in it with my coffee and I think, this is enough. This is more than enough. This is exactly where I'm supposed to be. I keep thinking about load bearing. It's an engineering concept, but it's also just life. Every structure has a point past which it cannot hold, not because it's weak, but because it was never designed to carry what's being asked of it. What happened in Brett's house didn't break me. It just clarified something I'd been too patient to see. I had been functioning as a support beam for people who'd stopped caring whether the structure stood. There's a version of this story where I stay, where I absorb the coldness, write the check for the addition, make myself smaller until I disappear into the guest room and everyone calls it working out. I've met men my age living that version. You can see it in how they hold themselves, carefully, apologetically, like they're always worried about taking up too much space in a room they pay for. I don't say that to judge them. I say it because I almost became one of them. And the only thing that stopped me was the look of relief on my son's face when I said I'd be gone by the weekend. That look was a gift, actually. It told me the truth faster than years of slow accommodation ever could have. What I've come to understand is that how a person treats you when they believe they have the upper hand is the most honest thing about them. Karen never raised her voice. She was always pleasant, always efficient. But she managed me the way you manage an asset, useful until it isn't, then quietly repositioned. And Brett, my son, let it happen, not out of cruelty, out of the particular weakness that comes from never having asked himself what kind of man he actually wants to be. That question takes courage to sit with. It's easier to manage the room. I don't tell this story to settle a score. I tell it because I think a lot of people my age are living inside arrangements that slowly cost them their dignity, one small accommodation at a time, and they've convinced themselves that's just what love requires. It doesn't. Love doesn't ask you to disappear, respect doesn't require shrinking, and real wisdom, the kind that takes decades to earn, isn't proved by how much you give. It's proved by knowing when to stop. The trust I set up for Lily and Jace wasn't revenge. It was clarity. I wanted those kids to have something solid that no argument, no financial pressure, no adult mistake could reach. That's what I could give them that mattered. Not monthly contributions toward a mortgage on a house where I wasn't welcome. Something that would still be standing when they're 30 and starting their own lives. Biscuit is snoring on the armchair as I write this. Lily texted me yesterday to ask when she could come back to the workshop. I have a woodworking club on Tuesday. My coffee is exactly right. It took 67 years, the death of my wife and my son telling me I wasn't welcome in his home for me to finally build a life that was entirely my own. I don't recommend the timeline, but I'll tell you this. The life on the other side of that door is quieter, lighter, and more fully mine than anything I've lived in years. I stopped holding up other people's structures and started building my own. Turns out, I'm still pretty good at it.